Let's talk a little bit about the expenses that you can write off in your e-commerce business. What's really cool is we have provided a business tax worksheet that outlines all the normal expenses you typically would have in an e-commerce business. So it's relatively easy to see what you can and can't write off. So I'm going to kind of go through some of the basic ones we generally see for most e-commerce businesses in this spreadsheet. I'm not going to talk about every single one that's on the spreadsheet. I'm just going to talk about the most common ones we see a lot and the common questions I tend to get specifically around the various expenses that you see on this spreadsheet. What I would recommend is downloading the business tax worksheet that's provided right here on this page, and it will outline all of the various categories that we have that can be written off. And then we also list out the various expenses that we have. So let's go ahead and kind of dig right in. Let me go ahead and move myself a little lower here, and let's take a look. So you can see we have this broken down by all the various categories. And again, like I mentioned, it gives you all the examples. The ones that are pretty much the most common that we'll typically see for most people who will be utilizing this business tax worksheet is we see things like continuing education, which is courses, books, seminars, things like that. That's like if you bought any specific courses, you went through them, you went through any sort of like books that you purchased, like if you bought some books off Amazon to learn how to do what you're doing or even get better at the business you're operating, that's what would be considered underneath continuing education. There's also some other things here as well, like some bank fees, so anything that you get from charged from a bank. So that would be like your late fees, ATM fees, monthly recurring fees, those sorts of things. Those all would be included with your bank fees. Anytime you're spending anything on advertising, that would be like pay-per-click. Any websites you've created, any influencers you've paid, any SEO you've done, all of that good stuff is all included with advertising. Anytime you spend money to actually get contract labor, so that would be anyone you hire outside the US. So let's say, for example, you hire someone to help you with sourcing from the Philippines. That is able to be written off, and that generally will go into the contract labor foreign section. If you actually hire independent contractors that are in the US, they generally will be underneath the contract labor area here. There's also another one down here for payroll labor, which will be, let me find it here. Reason why I couldn't see it because it's all the way down here at the bottom underneath wages, which is right here. So that would be underneath payroll for W-2 employees, will be right here down at the bottom. And then some other categories we have, if you have any equipment that you've purchased, which usually what we have as far as equipment, you'll usually see if it's under $2,500, the things we're talking about here are typically like a pallet jack, maybe you bought for your warehouse. Maybe you bought like a new laptop that could be considered equipment as well. Some people put those underneath office expenses, which is entirely possible. You could put it underneath here as well, but sometimes people put it underneath equipment. Another example could be maybe you bought a label printer that is specifically equipment. Maybe you bought a pricing gun that's all kind of like equipment type stuff, which some of these could also go underneath office expenses. It's kind of one of those things where you could put in either or. Of course, if you have insurance, which would be any sort of insurance you have specifically within your business, life and health insurance do not get included here because those are actually personal expenses. Any sort of internet you paid for, so that'd be Comcast, Spectrum, those sort of places, that's able to be written off. Inventory is by far the biggest expense we tend to see with any resellers. And so this would be for any sort of arbitrage sellers, any sort of private label sellers, any wholesale sellers, any of those sellers, inventory by far is the largest expense that we'll see. And that's another thing that can be written off as well. Any prep services you paid for, so if you used a third-party logistics service, that's another thing to be written off. Anything that you have disposed of. So let's say, for example, you bought some inventory and you just couldn't sell it because it is basically worthless. Maybe it expired. Maybe it was an out-of-season item that you just think you have no chance of selling, and you've decided to dispose of them in some fashion because they were damaged, that sort of thing. And that's also able to be written off as well as an expense. So we have that listed here as something that can be written off as well. If you hire us to do tax preparation, you hire us to do bookkeeping, those two things can also be written off on your taxes as well. Same thing with any lawyers, LLC filings, things like that. Business meals can also be written off as well, as long as they're bona fide business meals that you've had where you have specific meetings with people that are in the industry, or if you have someone within your business that is either a co-owner, or maybe you have a couple employees, contractors, and you have meals with them. That would be another business meeting meal that could be added as a specific expense. If you're traveling out of town, that also can be meals that are able to be written off. Other things we have here would be office expenses, so staplers, printers, anything you think of within your office. Another one to kind of think of here is anything that you would have in your warehouse. Like in some cases, people have their own warehouse. In some cases, they're running their business out of their home, and so they may have expenses associated with quote-unquote warehouse expenses that are actually things that are in their home. You can kind of lump all of those things right in here to office expenses. So some things you could list in here that could be part of this that isn't even necessarily staplers, printers, computers, monitors, desks, monitors. It could also be things like maybe you bought some sort of shipping supplies. It could be any sort of shipping supplies, which we do have a supply category here as well for that sort of thing. But sometimes you want to classify as an office expense because it just makes more sense to you. And so we have various categories here for all these various things. Other things you have is like if you're paying for a storage locker, a warehouse, that sort of thing, you can write that off. If you have shipping costs, that would be anything you've sent out via UPS, FedEx, USPS, Pirate Ship. Those are all written off as well. Another one will be software. So any sort of software tools you're using in your business, all of those can be written off too. Any sort of subscription service you have. So let's say, for example, you're paying for leads lists. Maybe you have seller basics. All of that sort of thing can also be written off as well. Any supplies, like I mentioned, boxes, tape, labels, paper, staplers, pens, all of that good stuff is all able to be written off. Another one is any sort of telephone services. So if you have any sort of cell phone, that sort of thing, those can generally be written off as well. Any sort of Amazon expenses. So if you're selling on Amazon, any sort of expenses charged specifically with Amazon, which would be like your shipping costs, your pick and pack fees, your commission fees, all of those are able to be deducted as well. If you're selling on Shopify, it would be your fees that Shopify charges you. Also, any sort of transaction fees that you're charged through Stripe or other services like that. If you're selling on Mercari, any of the Mercari fees are also able to be written off as well. So all of those are also deducted as well. Any travel you do, so if you have any airfare, Uber, Lyft, rental car, those sorts of things are also able to be written off. If you have any utilities, if you're in the business, so for example, if you actually own a warehouse, then any electricity, gas, water, internet, those sort of things that are for your warehouse, those are able to be written off. If you specifically are using your house and you have no specific warehouse at all and you're just using your house, then all of that stuff would be considered a separate expense, which would be a home office expense. So that's something that would be done separately from a standard expense, but it can be written off. It's just not part of our business tax worksheet here. Also, vehicle expenses. Generally, we recommend taking a mileage deduction. So if you're driving, we would recommend having a vehicle mileage log and keeping track of that, and then you get a deduction for that as well. So that's kind of the overview of all of the stuff you generally can be written off within your business. And so I would strongly recommend taking a look at our business tax worksheet, list out all of this stuff. And if you have any specific questions, feel free to reach out to us and we'll be glad to answer them. Thanks a lot.